In this video, I am going to discuss some of the relevant moral concerns regarding factory farming and the ethics of eating meat. One philosopher who has written extensively on this issue is Alistair Norcross from the University of Colorado Boulder. Norcross is probably best known for an argument known as the Fred analogy, which is primarily designed to support the claim that factory farming practices are grossly immoral and ought to be abolished. However, the Fred analogy also can be used to support the claim that it is generally wrong to kill animals to eat them. The analogy concerns the aforementioned Fred, who due to an unfortunate accident has lost his ability to taste chocolate. Now, this is especially depressing for Fred due to the fact that Fred loves chocolate. He lives for chocolate. In the hopes of finding a remedy for his condition, Fred visits his local doctor. Fred's doctor informs him that scientists have recently discovered a hormone called cocamone and have also discovered that ingesting cocamone not only accentuates the pleasure of eating chocolate, but can also restore one's taste for chocolate. The only catch involved is that cocamone is secreted by puppies' brains, and in order for the puppies' brains to secrete cocamone, the puppies need to be experiencing excruciating pain. Now, given how high the stakes are for the puppies, one would think that Fred decides he needs to live without chocolate and he has to swear off chocolate for the rest of his life in order to avoid harming puppies. Yeah, no. In order to restore his taste for chocolate, Fred sets up a puppy torture chamber in his basement and starts routinely torturing the puppies. The puppies are kept in cages for hours a day, living in squalor, and Fred takes a hot knife and nips off their noses, toes, and the ends of their tails, and then extracts the cocamone from their brains. After extracting the cocamone, Fred is then able to enjoy a brownie, a chocolate cake, or a chocolate cupcake in the same way that he used to. Fred's neighbors are obviously suspicious due to the constant yelping and crying coming from his basement, so they alert the authorities, and Fred is promptly arrested and charged with several cases of cruelty to animals. When the judge asks Fred to explain himself, he attempts to justify his actions by saying that he actually takes no pleasure in torturing the puppies. But torturing the puppies is simply necessary for him to get what he wants, which is to taste chocolate. But what we need to consider here is whether or not Fred's taste for chocolate morally outweighs or excuses the suffering of the puppies. Norcross thinks any morally minded individual would say no, it doesn't, and we actually have grounds to condemn Fred's actions as a result. But in considering the Fred analogy, we must also apply the case of Fred to our own case. First, Fred is causing immense suffering and harm to the puppies to satisfy his own tastes. Being able to taste chocolate is by no means a necessity. Secondly, it's also the case that in most developed nations, individuals eat meat simply to satisfy their own tastes and not out of necessity. Eating meat is not necessary to most individuals' survival, and most individuals in developed nations can easily switch to a vegan or vegetarian diet. Third, animals in factory farming operations experience immense suffering and harm in order for consumers to have an abundant supply of cheap meat. The conditions of animals in factory farms is comparable to the conditions that the puppies live in Fred's basement. But 1, 2, and 3 give inductive support for 4. If Fred's taste for chocolate does not morally justify or excuse the harm inflicted upon the puppies, then our taste for meat does not morally justify or excuse the harm inflicted upon the animals we routinely use as a food source. So if we think Fred's actions are morally condemnable, then on pain of inconsistency, we should also think that the actions of most meat eaters are morally condemnable as well. Now, if you are skeptical regarding whether this analogy actually works, you may think that the two cases are actually disanalogous, meaning the relevant differences between the two cases actually outweigh the relevant similarities. If this is the case, then we may have grounds to say that while Fred's actions are morally condemnable, this does not mean that the actions of most meat eaters are. However, what we need to keep in mind is that since this is a moral analogy, the differences we specify have to be morally relevant differences between the two cases. One potential area of disanalogy has to do with the fact that Fred is directly causing harm to the puppies, while this is not the case for most meat eaters. Most meat eaters do not slaughter their own animals, but rather go to the grocery store or meat market to purchase their meat. Now, while this is true, this is actually a potential objection that Norcross anticipates. Norcross asks us to consider a situation where it is not Fred that is torturing the puppies, but rather Fred's neighbor that is torturing the puppies. Fred is nevertheless aware of the conditions that the puppies live in, and he's also aware that mistreatment of the puppies is necessary to produce Cocamone. But Fred is buying Cocamone from his neighbor, fully aware of these conditions. So while Fred is not directly causing harm, he is nevertheless financially contributing to an industry that is causing harm. Under these circumstances, is Fred morally off the hook? Norcross does not think so. Norcross thinks Fred needs to be more ethical in his purchases. However, if this case is relevantly similar to the case of most meat eaters, then meat eaters are not morally off the hook either. And Norcross would say that meat eaters need to be more ethical in their purchases as well. Another potential difference is the fact that animals like cows, pigs, and chickens were specifically bred to use as a food source, while dogs were specifically bred for other purposes. Again, it is true that historically we have a difference in agricultural practice, but how is that a morally relevant difference? Suppose we started routinely making clones of human beings so that we could have an endless supply of vital organs available for transplant. Now, these human beings are certainly not produced through means of normal sexual reproduction, and they wouldn't exist at all were it not for the fact that they were being cloned specifically to use as a source of organs. But does it follow that these beings would have no moral standing at all? Would such a practice be morally permissible? Definitely not. So there are at least two important lessons to take from this line of reasoning. First of all, the fact that there is some historical precedent for engaging in a course of action is not enough to morally justify that course of action. There are all sorts of morally horrendous things that we can establish a historical precedent for, but that doesn't justify those kinds of things. Secondly, the purposes that we intend to use animals for has nothing to do with whether or not animals have direct moral standing. If animals have direct moral standing, they are owed moral consideration independently of our purposes for them and our attitudes about them. Now, the last potential area of disanalogy I will discuss here is what I'll just call the cuteness factor. Puppies are so cute. They are. I love puppies. Now, again, it is true that as a result of our agricultural and breeding practices, we have certain sentimental attachments to dogs that we typically do not have towards the animals we routinely use as a food source. But again, why is this a morally relevant difference? We need to remember that if animals have direct moral standing, they have it independently of our sentimental attachments to them. It's also true that if we looked at cows, pigs, and chickens as something other than a food source, chances are we would develop certain kinds of sentimental attachments to them. Cows enjoy head rubs and chin scratches the same way dogs do, and pigs are incredibly emotionally complex animals that are capable of forming strong emotional bonds in the same way that dogs do. Now, while Norcross's Fred analogy is primarily directed against factory farming, we can still ask questions about making the conditions of animals that we use for food more humane, and also ask about the ethics of killing animals to eat them more generally. Now, with respect to these questions, it's important to remember the following. First of all, most individuals do not eat meat as a matter of necessity. They do so simply to satisfy their tastes. Secondly, if we are capable of avoiding harm, then all things considered, we should avoid harm. And thirdly, most individuals in developed nations can easily change their eating habits. Most individuals in developed nations can easily become vegans or vegetarians. Every meat eater is in a position to avoid causing further harm, and given that animals are capable of being harmed, we have reason to think that animals have direct moral standing. Aside from the ethics of eating meat, it is worth looking into the social dynamics behind eating meat as well. Let's suppose that the price of ground beef goes up to about $50 a pound, so a good steak will now cost you around $200. Would it be worth the cost? I think most meat eaters would say no. The fact of the matter is that most individuals are meat eaters simply because there is an abundant supply of cheap meat. If there were not an abundant supply, most of us would not think it is worth it to spend that much on meat, and we could easily become vegans or vegetarians. But if we are not willing to spend that much on meat, then we really do not like eating meat as much as we think we do. If we really liked eating meat that much, we would be willing to pay for it. So, we may like to think that as consumers, we control the market through our purchases, but psychologically and socially, we are all conditioned to demand certain things of the market based on what we can get cheaply. Through manipulative advertising and things like that, we're all conditioned to be meat eaters. We're not naturally meat eaters. So, in that sense, the myth of consumer sovereignty in the market is just that. It's a myth. Another thing to keep in mind is that all agriculture causes harm. There cannot be any consumption without death and destruction, and that is true regardless of our eating habits. Now, while all agriculture causes harm, it is not the case that all agriculture is equally harmful. So, in cases where harm is inevitable, morally we need to focus on minimizing harm. Environmentally, we know that animal agriculture causes a lot more harm than plant agriculture does. So, if we focus on minimizing harm ethically, then we also need to focus on refining our agriculture and eating practices.